My name is Eleanor Hayes, and the day after I buried my husband, my credit card was declined in the middle of a crowded grocery store. I stood there with a cart full of groceries, my hands trembling around a box of cereal I had picked up without thinking. The cashier tried the card again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's still being declined." I stared at the little machine as if it had personally betrayed me. That card had worked the night before. Daniel and I had used it for years. It was connected to our joint account, the same account that paid for groceries, utilities, prescriptions, and the ordinary expenses of the life we'd built together. My husband had been dead for less than 24 hours, and somehow someone had already decided I no longer had the right to buy groceries. I left the cart where it was and walked outside with nothing but my purse and the phone in my hand. Before I even reached my car, it rang. It was my father-in-law, Richard. I answered. His voice was cold. "My son is dead. You don't get to spend his money anymore." For a moment I couldn't speak. "Richard, that's our joint account." "No," he said. "That was my son's money." I swallowed hard. Daniel and I shared that account. We paid our bills from it. We both used it. Then I heard Marilyn, my mother-in-law, speaking in the background. She didn't bother lowering her voice. "You're not family anymore." Those 6 words hurt more than I can explain. Not family. After 23 years of marriage. After every deployment. Every lonely night Daniel spent overseas. Every military ceremony where I stood proudly beside him. Every hospital waiting room. Every birthday he missed because his orders came first. Every night I stayed awake until I heard his key in the front door. Not family anymore. I closed my eyes. "Marilyn," I said quietly, "Daniel was my husband." "He was our son," she snapped. Richard came back on the phone. "You need to start making arrangements to leave the house." I looked through the windshield toward the quiet suburban neighborhood where Daniel and I had lived for years. "Our house." "Yes," Richard said. "Daniel's gone. Things have to go back to the family." Something inside me finally went still. I had spent the entire morning crying. I had cried when I woke up and reached across the bed. I had cried when I saw Daniel's boot still sitting beside the back door. I had cried when I found his coffee mug in the kitchen. But now I wasn't crying. I was thinking, "You forgot something, Richard." "What?" I looked directly at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Then I said, "You forgot who actually owns this house." Silence. For several seconds, neither of them said a word. Then Richard laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. "You really don't understand what's happening, Eleanor." "Oh, I understand perfectly." "No," he said. "You don't. Daniel was my son. That house was his home. It was our home. He paid for it." I almost laughed myself. Almost, because Richard had never bothered to ask whose name was on the deed. He had never cared. As far as he was concerned, Daniel being his son meant everything Daniel touched belonged to him and his wife. But there was something Richard didn't know. Something Daniel had made sure I would never forget. And that was the reason I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I drove home slowly. The house looked exactly the way it had when I left that morning. The porch light was still on. Daniel's old army jacket hung on the hook beside the door. His boots were underneath it. For 23 years, that sight had meant home. Now it felt like a warning. I stepped inside and stood in the quiet living room. There were sympathy cards on the coffee table. Flowers covered nearly every surface. A framed photograph from Daniel's retirement ceremony stood beside the fireplace. He was smiling in that picture. I touched the glass with my fingertips. "You knew," I whispered. I didn't know exactly what I meant. Maybe I was talking to Daniel. Maybe I was talking to myself. But suddenly I remembered something he had said several months before he died. It had been an ordinary Tuesday evening. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner and Daniel had been unusually quiet. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me and said, "If anything ever happens to me, Eleanor, don't let anyone rush you into signing anything." I laughed at the time. Why would anyone do that? He didn't laugh. "Just promise me." So I promised. Now, standing alone in our house one day after his funeral, I understood why. I walked into the garage. Daniel kept everything organized. Military habits never really left him. His tools were lined up perfectly. His fishing equipment sat in labeled containers. Old army paperwork was stored in plastic bins. I started looking through them. Then I saw it. A small black lockbox sitting behind an old toolbox. I had never seen it before. There was a white envelope taped to the top. My hands began to shake when I read the handwriting. It was Daniel's. 4 words were written across the front. "For Eleanor, open." I sat down on the garage floor. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked. A car passed. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But inside that garage, I realized my husband might have left me something far more important than money. He might have left me the truth, and I was about to find out why his parents were so desperate to make me believe I wasn't family anymore. I didn't open the box right away. I sat on the garage floor with Daniel's envelope in my lap, staring at his handwriting until the letters blurred behind my tears. For 23 years, that handwriting had been part of my life. Grocery lists, notes on the refrigerator, birthday cards, little reminders to call the insurance company or pick up milk on the way home. Now those familiar letters were telling me that my husband had expected something to happen after he was gone. And somehow I had a feeling that something had already begun. I carried the lockbox into the house and placed it on the dining room table. Before opening it, I made myself a cup of coffee. It was an old habit. When I was frightened, I made coffee. Daniel used to tease me about it. "You're the only person I know who thinks coffee can solve a crisis." Maybe he was right. But that morning I needed something familiar. I sat at the table and looked around the room. This was our home. Not just a building. Our home. We bought it years ago when Daniel was still serving full-time in the Army. We had looked at houses all over central Ohio before finding this one. It wasn't huge. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modest kitchen, a small backyard where Daniel planted tomatoes every summer.
But we loved it.
The first night we spent there, we ate pizza sitting on cardboard boxes because we hadn't unpacked the dining room furniture yet. Daniel raised a paper cup of soda and said, "To finally having a place where nobody can tell me when I have to leave." I laughed. He smiled. "We'll grow old here." Those words came back to me now. We thought we had decades left. Instead, I was sitting alone at that same table trying to figure out how to protect the life we'd built. I opened the lockbox. Inside were several folders, a small USB drive, copies of insurance documents, and a thick envelope with my name on it. There were also property records. I pulled them out first. The deed to our house. I already knew what it said, but seeing it in black and white made my breathing slow. My name was there, the legal owner. Not Richard. Not Marilyn. Not even Daniel alone. Me? I remembered Richard's voice that morning. "You need to start making arrangements to leave the house." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I opened the next folder. There were copies of our mortgage documents, homeowners, insurance tax records, and several bank statements. Daniel had kept everything. Every payment. Every document. Every important piece of paper. He had always been meticulous. His military training had made him that way. When we traveled, he carried folders. When we bought the house, he kept every receipt. When he retired from active duty, he organized his records into labeled binders. I used to tease him. "You think the government is going to come knocking because we misplaced a receipt for a lawnmower?" He'd smile. "You never know." Now I understood. Daniel had never been paranoid. He had simply believed that important things should be documented. At the bottom of the box was another envelope. This one was addressed to my wife, Eleanor. I opened it carefully. The letter was several pages long. Daniel began by apologizing for writing it. Then he explained something that made my heart ache. He had been worried about what would happen to me if he died before I did. Not just financially, emotionally. He knew I would be grieving. He knew I might be vulnerable. And he knew his parents could become difficult when they were frightened or angry. Daniel wrote that his parents loved him, but they had always struggled with control. When he was younger, they had made most of his decisions. Even after he became an adult, they often believed they knew what was best for him. He wrote about arguments we'd had over boundaries, about times when Richard had questioned our financial decisions, about Marilyn asking how much money we had in savings. I remembered those conversations. At the time, I had dismissed them as normal family tension. Daniel hadn't. He had been paying attention. Then I reached the sentence that stopped me. "If something happens to me, do not let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what we built together." I put the letter down. My eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. Of course, there was no answer. I kept reading. Daniel told me that I should never sign documents I didn't understand. He told me to keep the original deed and important financial records somewhere safe. And most importantly, he told me to get professional advice before allowing anyone else to handle his estate. That last part made me think about Richard, because Richard had already offered to help. He had called less than an hour after the funeral. He had asked where Daniel kept his financial papers. He had asked about Daniel's life insurance. He had asked whether I had found the military records. At the time, I thought he was grieving. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, Richard came to the house. I was standing in the kitchen when I heard his truck pull into the driveway. I didn't invite him inside. He walked up to the front door anyway. When I opened it, Marilyn was behind him. Richard looked past me into the house. "We need to talk." "About what?" "Daniel's affairs." I kept one hand on the door. "I'll handle them." He frowned. "You don't understand everything that needs to be done. I have an attorney." That changed his expression. "You already hired one?" "Yes." Marilyn stepped forward. "Eleanor, we're family. You don't need to make this difficult." I looked at her. "You told me yesterday that I wasn't family anymore." She looked away. Richard cleared his throat. "That was said in anger." It was still said. He sighed. Then he tried a different approach. "Daniel would want us to work together." I almost smiled. Because Daniel had written the opposite. He had specifically warned me not to let anyone pressure me while I was grieving. "I'll handle Daniel's estate through the proper channels," I said. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe." I closed the door. Then I locked it. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something besides grief. I felt prepared. Later that afternoon, I drove to the office of an estate attorney in downtown Columbus. I carried Daniel's documents in a plain folder. The attorney's name was Margaret Collins. She was in her early 60s, calm and direct, with the kind of voice that made you feel she had seen every family dispute imaginable. She reviewed the deed, then the bank statements, then Daniel's letter. When she finished, she looked at me. "Eleanor, your husband did something very important." "What?" "He left you a roadmap." I swallowed. "Does that mean I'm safe?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands on the desk. "It means you're in a much stronger position than you realize, but we need to look at every financial account and every document before we assume anything." She turned another page. Then she stopped. Her expression changed. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed to a transaction on one of Daniel's bank statements. "This transfer occurred just days before his death." I leaned closer. I recognized the account number, but I didn't recognize the transaction. Someone had moved money, and I knew Daniel hadn't told me about it. For the first time, I wondered whether the fight over my husband's money had started before we even buried him. The number on the statement belonged to an account Daniel and I had used only occasionally. I stared at the transaction until the numbers stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a warning. Could Daniel have authorized this? I asked. Margaret Collins, my attorney, didn't answer immediately. "He could have," she said, "but we shouldn't assume he did." She turned the statement toward herself. "The important question is where the money went." I gave her the folder containing the remaining records from Daniel's lockbox. She studied them carefully. The transfer had been made 4 days before Daniel died. The amount wasn't enough to make someone rich, but it was large enough to matter more than $20,000. $20,000. 4 days before my husband died. I felt sick. Daniel had never hidden money from me. We had always talked about our finances. We weren't wealthy, but we knew what we had, what we owed, and what we planned to leave behind. So why had this transfer happened? Margaret asked me a question. "Did your husband ever give his father access to this account?" I thought about it. "I don't think so." "Did Richard ever handle Daniel's finances?" "No." "Did he ever have power of attorney?" "Not that I'm aware of." Margaret nodded. "Then we need to find out exactly what happened." She explained that grief could make families vulnerable to financial mistakes, and that even well-meaning relatives sometimes crossed boundaries after a death. But she also warned me not to accuse anyone without evidence. That was important. I wasn't interested in revenge based on suspicion. I wanted facts. When I returned home, I found 3 missed calls from Richard. There was also a voicemail. His voice sounded irritated. "Eleanor, call me. We need those financial documents. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I listened to it twice. Then I saved it. I didn't know why at first. Something in me simply said, keep everything. That evening I went through Daniel's desk. He had kept his military records in one drawer and personal papers in another. At the bottom of the second drawer, I found an old folder labeled Financial. Inside were statements from several years earlier. I spread them across the dining room table. The account in question had once been almost empty. Then after Daniel retired from active duty, he had started putting money into it. It was his emergency savings, our safety net. I kept searching, and then I found something that made my heart pound. A handwritten note from Daniel. It said, "Talk to Eleanor before making any changes." That was all. No date. No explanation. But it was his handwriting. I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "I found something." "Tell me." I read the note to her. She was quiet. "Keep it exactly where you found it," she said. Don't write on it. Don't fold it. We'll preserve it as evidence of your husband's instructions. Evidence. That word sounded frightening. Until then, part of me had still hoped this was simply a misunderstanding. Maybe Daniel had moved the money. Maybe he had forgotten to tell me. Maybe the bank had made an error. But the more we looked, the less accidental everything seemed. The following morning, Margaret contacted the bank. The bank wouldn't release every detail immediately, but they confirmed something important. The transfer had been initiated electronically, and the receiving account wasn't in Daniel's name. I felt my stomach tighten. Whose account was it? Margaret looked at me. That's what we're trying to determine. 2 days later, we had our answer. The receiving account belonged to a small consulting company, a company I had never heard of. But its mailing address was familiar. It was Richard's address. I sat completely still. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. My father-in-law. Margaret nodded. We need more documentation before we draw conclusions. I wanted to call Richard immediately. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to hear his voice and ask how he could possibly justify taking $20,000 from an account that Daniel and I had built together. But Margaret stopped me. Don't call him yet. Why? Because if he knows what we've found, he may change his story. I hated how sensible she sounded. I hated that this was happening at all. But I agreed. That afternoon, Richard and Marilyn came to the house again. This time I opened the door only halfway. Richard looked at me. Why haven't you given us Daniel's financial papers? Because they're part of the estate. They belong with the family. Daniel's estate is being handled properly. Marilyn crossed her arms. You're making this about money. I almost laughed. You're the ones who keep asking me for financial records. Richard stepped closer. Your husband would be ashamed of how you're behaving. That sentence hurt. It was meant to. He knew exactly where to strike. Daniel was my weakness. His memory was sacred to me. For a moment, I felt 16 different emotions at once. Then I remembered the letter. If something happens to me, do not let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what we built together. I looked Richard directly in the eye. You don't get to speak for Daniel anymore. His face hardened. Excuse me. You heard me? Marilyn gasped. Richard pointed toward the house. That home belongs to my son. No. My voice was calm. It belongs to me. He stared at me. You're really going to fight us over a house? This isn't a fight over a house. Then what is it? It's about boundaries. I closed the door. This time I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired. That night I sat on the edge of my bed. Daniel's side was untouched. His pillow still had the shape of his head. I picked up his old watch from the nightstand. He had worn it almost every day during his army career. I held it against my chest. I don't know what you were trying to protect me from, I whispered. But I'm trying. The next morning Margaret called. I have an update. I sat down. What did you find? The bank confirmed the receiving account. My heart began beating faster. And it belongs to a company controlled by your father-in-law. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Can they prove Daniel authorized the transfer, I asked. We're still investigating. Then why would Richard take the money? I don't know yet. I looked at Daniel's empty chair across the kitchen. Then something occurred to me. What if he didn't take it for himself? Margaret paused. What do you mean? What if someone told him Daniel owed money? What if he was trying to move it before Daniel died? That's possible. But why? That's the question we need answered. She told me to search Daniel's records for any recent business agreements, loans, debts, or correspondence involving his father. I spent the entire afternoon going through papers. At first I found nothing. Then, tucked inside an old military file, I found a letter from Richard. It was dated 6 months earlier. The first line made my blood run cold. Daniel, we need to talk about what happens to your money when you're gone. I read the sentence again. When you're gone? Not if. When. My hands started shaking. Daniel's father had written about his death 6 months before it happened. And suddenly I wasn't just wondering whether Richard had taken money. I was wondering whether Richard had been preparing for Daniel's death long before any of us knew it was coming. I read Richard's letter 3 times before I could bring myself to put it down. The words had been written 6 months before Daniel died, but they sounded different now. Daniel, we need to talk about what happens to your money when you're gone. I kept hearing that sentence in my head. When you're gone. Not if something happens. Not in case of an emergency. When you're gone. I took the letter to Margaret the next morning. She read it without saying a word. When she finished, she placed it carefully on her desk. This is concerning, she said. Concerning. I could hear the anger rising in my voice. My husband was alive when this was written. I understand. His father was already talking about what would happen to his money. Margaret nodded. But Eleanor, we still need facts. The letter alone doesn't prove that Richard knew Daniel would die. I know. I took a breath. I just don't know what to believe anymore. Margaret leaned back. Then don't believe anything yet. Investigate. That was exactly what we did. She requested records from the bank, including the authorization associated with the $20,000 transfer. While we waited, I went through Daniel's papers again. This time I found an envelope from his financial institution. Inside was a statement showing the account balance before the transfer. The amount was much higher than I expected. Daniel had been quietly building that emergency fund for years. It was money we had planned to use when we were older. Maybe for travel. Maybe for medical expenses. Maybe just for the peace of knowing we had something set aside. I remembered him once telling me, "When you're my age, Eleanor, you don't want to be one unexpected bill away from trouble." He had been right. And now someone had taken a portion of that safety net while I was still arranging flowers from his funeral. I called the bank myself. The representative confirmed that the transfer was under review. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. There was another attempted transaction. When, 2 days after Mr. Hayes passed away, I gripped the phone. Was it successful? No, it was declined. Who attempted it? I can't give you that information over the phone. I understood. After we hung up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table. Someone had tried again. After Daniel died, that meant whoever was doing this knew he was gone. I immediately called Margaret. She told me not to contact Richard or Marilyn. Let the bank investigate. But what if they try again? They won't have access if we secure everything properly. That afternoon we changed passwords, notified the financial institutions, and placed additional protections on the accounts. I also checked the beneficiaries on our insurance policies. Daniel had been thorough. My name was listed exactly as he had intended. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of relief. Then Richard arrived. He didn't call first. He simply walked onto the porch and knocked. I opened the door. "What do you want?" His face was tense. "I heard you were changing the accounts." I said nothing. "You had no right to do that. They're my accounts too." They were Daniel's accounts. Our joint accounts. He stepped closer. "Eleanor, you're making a huge mistake." "No, I'm protecting myself." "You're keeping my son's money away from his family." I looked at him. "Which family?" He frowned. "What does that mean?" "The family you said I wasn't part of." His expression hardened. That was said in anger. "You've said a lot of things in anger." Marilyn appeared behind him. "Eleanor, please, we're grieving." "So am I." She looked down. Richard didn't soften. "Daniel would want us to have access to his things. You can have the things that belong to you. And his money, whatever legally belongs to his estate, will be handled through probate." He shook his head. "You've gotten legal advice." "Yes." "From that attorney?" "Yes." He cursed under his breath. Then he said something I will never forget. "You're going to regret turning against this family." I felt the old fear return, but this time it didn't control me. "I didn't turn against your family." I held his gaze. "You turned against me." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked away. Marilyn followed him without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it. My hands were shaking. I was still afraid, but I wasn't helpless. That distinction mattered. 2 days later, Margaret called. "We have the bank records." I sat down before she even finished the sentence. The transfer was authorized using credentials associated with Daniel's account. Daniel made it. Not necessarily. What does that mean? It means someone had access to information that allowed the transaction to be initiated. My heart sank. "Can the bank tell us where it came from?" "They're working on that." Then she added, "But we found something else." "What?" "The receiving company has an outstanding business loan." I waited. "And the loan is personally guaranteed by Richard Hayes." I closed my eyes. Suddenly, the $20,000 looked different. Richard wasn't simply moving money. He might have been trying to cover a financial problem. "Does Daniel have anything to do with that company?" "No." "Then why would money from Daniel's account go there?" "That is exactly what we need to establish." I remembered Richard's constant questions about Daniel's finances. The pressure. The demands. The urgency. The way he had tried to get his hands on the paperwork immediately after the funeral. It was beginning to form a picture. But there was still one piece missing. That evening I searched Daniel's office. I opened every drawer. I checked every folder. Finally, behind an old army photograph, I found a small notebook. Daniel's handwriting filled several pages. Most of it was ordinary. Appointments. Phone numbers. reminders. Then I found an entry dated 3 months before his death. It said, Dad asked again about the company, told him no. I turned the page. Another entry. Dad says he needs temporary help. I told him Eleanor and I have our own obligations. Then another. Do not loan him money. I sat back in Daniel's chair. My husband had known. His father had been asking him for money, and Daniel had refused. But 4 days before Daniel died, $20,000 had been transferred into a company controlled by Richard. I couldn't stop the tears, not because of the money, because Daniel had been carrying this burden quietly. He had been trying to protect me without frightening me. I closed the notebook. Then my phone rang. It was Margaret. Eleanor, there's something else you need to know. What? We found the person who initiated the transfer. My heart stopped. Who? She paused. Your father-in-law. I stared into the empty room. For the first time since Daniel died, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't grief. And it wasn't a family disagreement. Someone had taken money that didn't belong to him. And he had done it while believing I would be too broken to fight back. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's notebook in front of me, staring at the sentence he had written months before his death. Do not loan him money. Those 5 words told me more than any accusation could have. Daniel had known his father was struggling financially. He had refused to give him money. And then somehow $20,000 had moved from an account Daniel and I shared into a company controlled by Richard. I wanted to believe there had to be an explanation. Maybe Daniel had changed his mind. Maybe he had helped his father one last time. Maybe there was something I didn't understand. But then I remembered the bank representative telling me someone had attempted another transaction after Daniel died. That couldn't have been Daniel, and it couldn't have been an accident. The next morning I met Margaret at her office. She had already prepared a folder. We have enough to take action, she said. I looked at her. Will we get the money back? We can pursue it. What about Richard? If the evidence supports what we believe, he may have serious legal problems. I lowered my eyes. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want my husband's father arrested. I didn't want his mother sitting alone in some courtroom. I wanted answers. I wanted Daniel back. But I knew neither was possible. Margaret continued. There is something else we need to discuss. She handed me another document. It was a beneficiary statement. Daniel had named me as the primary beneficiary on his life insurance policy. I knew about the policy, but I hadn't realized how carefully Daniel had arranged everything. There were also retirement benefits and a survivor benefit connected to his military service. The paperwork was clear. He had planned for me. He had wanted to make sure I wouldn't be left without a home or financial support. I started crying. Why didn't he ever tell me all this? Margaret gave me a tissue. Some people prepare for the worst without wanting their loved ones to live in fear of it. That sounded exactly like Daniel. He had always been that way. He checked the tires before long trips. He kept emergency supplies in the basement. He made sure our smoke detectors worked. He didn't talk about disasters. He prepared for them. And now I understood that he had prepared for mine. When I got home, Richard was waiting in the driveway. I stopped the car but didn't get out. He walked toward my window. We need to talk. I lowered it halfway. What about... Your attorney contacted me. I expected that. You're accusing me of stealing from my own son. I didn't accuse you of anything. You know exactly what you're doing. I looked at him. No, Richard, I know exactly what you did. His face changed. For a moment I saw fear. Then anger replaced it. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me. He said nothing. I waited. Finally he said I needed temporary help. With what? My business. And Daniel gave it to you. He was going to. I stared at him. Was going to? Richard looked away. He understood. No, I said quietly. He didn't. Richard's jaw tightened. Your husband was my son. And he told you no. He changed his mind. Then why didn't he tell me? Richard didn't answer. That was all I needed. I rolled up the window. He put his hand against the car. Eleanor, don't do this. I looked straight ahead. You should have thought about that before you touched our money. I drove away. For the first time, I didn't look back. A week later, the bank completed its initial investigation. The transfer was unauthorized. The money was frozen before Richard's company could move it again. The attempted post-death transaction had also been blocked. Margaret began the process of recovering the funds. But there was another problem. Richard had apparently told several relatives that I was refusing to share Daniel's estate with his parents. Within days, I started receiving messages. Some relatives I barely knew accused me of being greedy. One woman wrote that Daniel would be ashamed of me. Another said I should do the Christian thing and give Richard whatever he wanted. I deleted most of the messages, then I saved screenshots of all of them. Margaret had taught me something important. I didn't have to defend myself to everyone. I only had to protect the truth. One evening Marilyn called. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to pick up. Eleanor. Yes, she was crying. I need to talk to you. I sat down. About what? Daniel. My chest tightened. What about him? I found something in his room. She paused. It was a letter. What kind of letter? I don't know if I should give it to you. Then why are you calling? Because I think you should have it. The next afternoon Marilyn came to my house. She looked older than she had only weeks before. She carried a small envelope. She placed it on the table. Richard doesn't know I have this. I looked at her. What's inside? Daniel wrote it for us. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Why didn't you give it to me before? She looked down. Because I was angry. At me. Yes. Why? She wiped her eyes. Because you were still here. The words hit me harder than I expected. She continued. Daniel was gone. You were alive. And every time I looked at you I remembered that he wasn't coming back. I didn't know what to say. Grief had made all of us people we didn't recognize. But grief didn't excuse what they had done. I opened the letter. Daniel's handwriting filled the page. Mom and Dad, it began. If you're reading this, something happened to me. I stopped. Marilyn began crying quietly beside me. I continued. Daniel wrote that he loved his parents. But he also wrote that Eleanor was his wife, his partner, and the person he trusted most. He asked his parents to respect our marriage. He asked them never to make me choose between them and my own dignity. Then I reached the final paragraph. If I die before Eleanor, please don't make her fight for the life we built together. She has already lost enough. I couldn't read anymore. I pressed the letter against my chest. Marilyn covered her face. I didn't know he wrote that. I looked at her. Neither did I. She whispered, I'm sorry. It was the first time either of them had said those words. But I wasn't ready to accept them. Not yet. I folded the letter carefully. Marilyn, I want you to understand something. She looked at me. I will not let what happened disappear just because we're grieving. She nodded through her tears. I know. And I won't give Richard anything that doesn't belong to him. I know. But I also won't take anything that belongs to you. She looked confused. What do you mean? Daniel had photographs, his military medals, letters from when he was young. Those things belong with his family too. She began crying again. You'd give those to us? Some of them? She reached across the table and touched my hand. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I didn't pull away. But I wasn't ready to forgive. There was still one thing left. I still had Daniel's final letter. And I knew exactly where I needed to read it. In front of Richard. Because if he wanted to claim Daniel's name to justify what he had done then, he needed to hear what Daniel himself had wanted. The following morning I called Margaret. I want to meet with Richard and Marilyn. Are you sure? Yes. Why? I looked at Daniel's photograph on the mantel. Because there's something my husband wanted them to know. I paused. And this time I'm going to make sure they hear every word. The meeting took place 3 days later in Margaret's conference room. I arrived early. I sat at the end of the long wooden table with Daniel's letter in front of me. For several minutes I simply looked at it. I knew what was written inside. I had already read it twice. But I also knew that once I read it aloud, nothing between Richard, Marilyn, and me would ever be the same. Margaret sat beside me. You don't have to do this, she said. Yes, I do. Why? Because Richard keeps saying he knows what Daniel wanted. I placed my hand on the envelope. I want him to hear it from Daniel. A few minutes later, the door opened. Richard walked in first. Marilyn followed. Richard looked at me without saying hello. He sat across from me. Marilyn sat beside him. Margaret closed the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard said, I assume this is about the money. It is, I said, but not only about the money. He leaned back. You've already involved lawyers and the bank. Yes. You've made this much bigger than it needed to be. I looked at him. You transferred $20,000 from an account that belonged to Daniel and me into a company you controlled. I told you I needed temporary help. Without asking me. It was Daniel's money. It was our money. Richard's voice rose. He was my son. And he was my husband. The room became silent. I took a breath. I am not going to argue with you about who loved Daniel more. That's not something anyone can measure. Richard looked away. But I will not allow you to use his death to erase my marriage. Marilyn lowered her head. I opened the envelope. "This is Daniel's letter to both of you." Richard frowned. "I've heard enough." "No," I said quietly. "You haven't." I began reading. "Mom and Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I don't know when you'll find this letter, but I need you to understand something before grief makes decisions for you." Richard's expression changed. I continued. "Eleanor is my wife. She is not an outsider. She is not someone who came into our family and took me away from you." Marilyn began crying. I kept reading. "She has stood beside me through every difficult season of my life. When I was deployed, she waited. When I came home exhausted, she cared for me. When I was afraid, she never made me feel weak." My voice broke. I stopped for a moment. Margaret quietly slid a tissue toward me. I wiped my eyes. Then I continued. "If something happens to me, please don't make her fight for the life we built together." Richard stared at the table. "She has already lost enough." I looked directly at him. "Please don't turn your grief into anger against her." My voice shook. "But if you're angry, be angry at me for leaving too soon. Don't punish the person who has to wake up every morning without me." Marilyn covered her mouth. Richard didn't move. I reached the final paragraph. "Love her the way you loved me. If you cannot do that yet, at least respect her." I folded the letter. No one spoke. The silence lasted so long that I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Finally, Richard looked up. His eyes were red. I didn't know he wrote that. I didn't either. He looked at Marilyn. "Did you?" She shook her head. Richard leaned back. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, he looked old. Not angry. Not powerful. Just old. A father who had lost his son. A man who had made terrible choices while grieving. He rubbed both hands over his face. "I thought I was protecting what belonged to Daniel." I answered carefully. "You were protecting what you believed belonged to you." He looked at me. "That isn't fair." "No," I said, "it isn't." I reached into my folder and placed several documents on the table. "The house is mine. The accounts will be handled according to the law. Daniel's benefits and insurance have designated beneficiaries. His estate will go through the proper process." Richard stared at the papers. "I don't want to fight you anymore. I don't want to fight you either." "Then why are you doing all this?" "Because I need boundaries." He nodded slowly. I continued. "I will never apologize for protecting myself. I understand. I also won't keep Daniel's belongings from you." Marilyn looked up. "What do you mean?" "I have his military medals, some photographs, and several letters from his childhood." She started crying again. "I want you to have copies and some of the things that belong to your family." Richard looked at me. "Why?" "Because I'm not trying to punish you." He swallowed. "After everything?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about Daniel. Because he had spent his life serving people. Because he had taught me that strength wasn't always about winning. Because I didn't want to become cruel simply because someone had been cruel to me. Because Daniel wouldn't want that. Richard looked down. Then he whispered, "You're right." Those two words broke something open in him. He began to cry. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way older men sometimes cry when they have spent their whole lives believing they weren't supposed to. "I was so angry," he said. "I know. I kept thinking that if you weren't there, maybe this would feel less real." I nodded. "But it didn't." "No. It just made everything worse." Marilyn reached for my hand. This time I let her take it. She squeezed my fingers. "I am sorry," she said. I looked at her. "I believe that. But you don't forgive us." "Not yet." She nodded. "I understand." That was the first honest conversation we'd had since Daniel died. There were no threats, no accusations, no demands. Just three grieving people sitting around a table finally admitting the truth. Before we left, Richard stood. He looked at me. "I owe you an apology." "You do." He nodded. "At the grocery store when I said you weren't family anymore." His voice broke. "I was wrong." I didn't answer immediately. "Then I said you were?" He took a breath. "I hope someday you'll forgive me." I hope so too. But I wasn't ready to promise. Forgiveness wasn't a switch. It wasn't something I could turn on because someone finally said sorry. I had spent too many years believing that keeping peace meant swallowing pain. Daniel had taught me something different. Peace without boundaries wasn't peace. It was surrender. When I walked out of Margaret's office, the afternoon sun was shining through the windows. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking toward something. My life. My home. My future. And the memory of a husband who had trusted me enough to prepare me for the hardest chapter of my life. The revenge Richard never expected wasn't destroying him. It was refusing to let him destroy me. and I was finally ready to live again. 6 months after Daniel's funeral, I stood in the kitchen one Saturday morning and realized I had gone almost an entire day without crying. That might sound like a small thing. To me, it felt enormous. For months, grief had followed me everywhere. It was there when I woke up. It sat beside me at breakfast. It followed me through the grocery store. It waited for me when I turned the key in the front door and remembered that Daniel would never again call out, "I'm home." But slowly, almost without my noticing, life had started moving again. I still missed him. I always would. But missing someone and being unable to live without them were two different things. I had finally learned that. The house had changed too. Not because I had renovated it or bought new furniture. I had simply stopped seeing every room as a reminder of what I had lost. The kitchen became my kitchen again. The garden became my garden. The old chair where Daniel used to read the newspaper became a place where I could sit with my coffee without feeling as though I was trespassing in a memory. His army jacket was still hanging by the door. I couldn't bring myself to move it. Maybe someday I would, but not yet. One afternoon I received a letter. The envelope had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Richard. I sat at the dining room table before opening it. For a moment I considered putting it away. Then I remembered the promise I had made to myself. I wasn't going to run from difficult things anymore. I opened the envelope. The letter was only 2 pages. Richard didn't make excuses. He didn't blame grief. He didn't mention the money. He didn't ask for anything. He simply wrote the truth. He said that after Daniel died, he had become consumed by fear. Fear that his son was gone. Fear that everything Daniel had worked for would disappear. Fear that he was losing control. And instead of facing those feelings, he had turned them against me. Then came the sentence that made me stop reading. I was so afraid of losing my son that I almost destroyed the last person he trusted. I put the letter down. I stared out the window. For months, I had wanted Richard to understand what he had done. Now he did. That didn't erase it. But it mattered. At the bottom of the letter, he asked whether Marilyn and he could visit Daniel's grave with me. I thought about it for a long time. Then I called him. He answered almost immediately. "Hello, it's Eleanor." There was a long pause. "Thank you for calling. I read your letter. I meant every word." "I know." Another silence. Then I said, "I'll meet you Sunday." We met at the cemetery on a cool Sunday afternoon. Daniel's grave was beneath a large oak tree. I had chosen the spot because he loved trees. He used to say that a good tree reminded him that strength didn't always mean standing alone. Sometimes it meant having deep roots. Richard and Marilyn were already there when I arrived. They looked nervous. So did I. Marilyn carried a small bouquet of flowers. Richard held his hat in both hands. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Marilyn walked toward the grave and placed the flowers beside Daniel's marker. "I miss you, sweetheart," she whispered. Richard stood beside her. "I do too, son." I watched them. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt sadness. Not only for Daniel, for everything that had happened after his death. For the months we had wasted fighting when we could have been grieving together. Richard turned toward me. "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For keeping his memory alive." I shook my head. "He did that himself." Richard smiled sadly. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "You were right." I smiled faintly. "About what?" "The house." I laughed softly. He actually laughed too. "I really did forget who owned it." "Yes, you did." He nodded. "And I'm sorry." "I know." We stood there quietly. Then Richard asked if he could see some of Daniel's belongings. I told him I had brought a box. Inside were photographs from Daniel's childhood, several letters from his mother, and a few items from his early army years. Richard opened the box slowly. When he found a photograph of Daniel as a teenager, he smiled. That was his first fishing trip with me. I sat beside him. He told me about it. "He did. Many times." Richard laughed. "He fell into the creek." "I know." "He blamed the fish." I laughed. For the first time we were remembering Daniel instead of arguing about him. That moment changed something. Not everything. Some wounds don't disappear. But something softened. I eventually forgave Richard and Marilyn. Not because what they had done was acceptable. It wasn't. Not because I had forgotten the grocery store. I hadn't. And not because forgiveness meant giving them unrestricted access to my life. It didn't. I forgave them because I realized I didn't want to carry their anger for the rest of mine. That was the real freedom. I also learned things I wish someone had taught me years earlier. When a spouse dies, grief can make even simple financial decisions overwhelming. That is exactly why families need to prepare before a crisis happens. Know whose name is on the deed. Know how your joint accounts work. Keep copies of wills, insurance policies, retirement documents, and other important records. Review your beneficiaries. And if someone suddenly pressures you to sign something after a loved one dies, stop. Take a breath. Get independent legal advice. You do not have to make a permanent decision while your heart is still broken. I learned those lessons the hardest way possible. But they changed me. A year after Daniel's death, I stood in the grocery store again. The same store. The same checkout area. I placed my groceries on the belt. When the cashier handed me the receipt, I looked down at it and smiled. I remembered the day my card had been declined. I remembered Richard's words. "My son is dead. You don't get to spend his money anymore." Back then, I thought that moment was the beginning of the worst chapter of my life. I was wrong. It was the beginning of the chapter where I learned who I was without Daniel beside me. I had thought losing my husband meant losing everything. Instead, I discovered that love can leave you with strength you didn't know you possessed. Daniel didn't leave me helpless. He left me prepared. And he left me with one final lesson. Protect the people you love. Tell them what matters. Put important things in writing. And never assume that family will automatically do the right thing when grief enters the room. Sometimes they will. Sometimes they won't. But you can still choose who you become. I drove home that afternoon and pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet. The porch light was off. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Daniel's jacket was still hanging by the entryway. I touched the sleeve. "I made it," I whispered. And for the first time, saying those words didn't feel like admitting that he was gone. It felt like telling him I had kept my promise. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after losing someone you loved, I hope this story reminds you that grief does not mean the end of your story. And if someone you care about needs to hear that message, share this with them. Sometimes a simple story can remind another person that they are stronger than they feel today. And if this story touched your heart, stay with us for more stories about family courage, second chances, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting even. It's finding peace without giving up your dignity. Daniel taught me that, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life.